Hello there. Today I'm back in Pu-erh city and I want to continue the discussion I started while I was in Chiang Mai about terroir. In this video I'm going to talk about the man-made factors of terroir. Okay, last time in the first part of my essay I was talking about, for example, the varietals, the microclimate, the geography of the place, the altitude, the soil quality. These things are, well, you could say fairly out of control of people, or at least not on a short time scale. And today I want to talk about, yes, this aspect of terroir that makes that I think terroir is a dynamic concept. It's a dynamic concept because it is constantly changing, influenced by the public policy, by the recent history of the place, by people's choices. And to guide me through this discussion, I would like to brew this tea. This is a tea from Laos. Yes, we finally got a decent amount of good tea from good gushu from Laos at the border with Yiwu, at the border with Guaphongzai. So it's Nyot U district. It's the place we've been working for over 2 years now. We've been doing consulting jobs there, and I'm happy to say that we now have a tea that we're going to be able to sell. So that's why we've just pressed the cakes. So it's from Huewa village. It's one of the villages of the two valleys that we've been working in. So this valley is not connected to the road to Guaphongzai. It's the other valley more in the north, which goes more into Mansa. So it leads to Mansa. So it's more in the north of Nyatu district. But well, they are still quite close. And in terms of taste, well, we're gonna find it out. Okay. So I just got the cakes back from the factory yesterday. I'm gonna wait maybe for a week before I offer it on farmer leaf to make sure that the cakes recover. And now what we're gonna try will be the maocha. I still have a bit of maocha that I will probably press. So let's do this. I think my water is already hot, so I'm gonna put the tea in. Very beautiful leaves and good processing. So I'm happy that you can finally get a taste of that Laos tea. But okay, let's start with the terroir. So before starting the video, I took a few notes that I will use as a guideline. I also called a friend of mine who's doing a PhD in agriculture in France, and we discussed that terroir concept for maybe 4 hours. It gave me quite a lot of insights. And he insisted a lot that that conception of terroir is dynamic. It's the interaction between man and nature. And he also insisted a lot that the concept is not well defined. It really depends on who you are. So you have terroir for a geographer, terroir for an agronomist, terroir for an economist, terroir for a marketer, and terroir for a consumer. And so we talked a bit about the differences between these approaches. I think in this video, I'm gonna keep it simple and just present the terroir in the eyes of the geographer and the terroir in the eyes of the consumer and where they interact. Let me just check my notes. Oh, and I figure that I have nothing to discard this water, so let me go and take something. I'll be back in a minute. Yes, here I am with the little bowl that was offered to me by Marcel from Germany. He made it himself. It's a very beautiful bowl that I sometimes use to drink tea directly from it, but most of the time I just use it to put my water. It's really beautiful. You can check his work on Instagram, Marcel Karcher. He makes very beautiful teaware. Okay, so let's start. So in this tea, I've had it many times before, and you always get a smoky taste. Well, slightly smoky, but it's not too disturbing, it's not too much. And this for me is a hint of the terroir. Why is there a smoky taste? Because in that area people are not used to storing the tea. Actually, they usually sell it very quickly. Every week you have buyers from Yiwu Mountain in China who come to the village and source the tea. So they don't have the facilities to store tea in the long term. Now this year we had the coronavirus crisis, which means that those visitors from Yiwu couldn't come because the small roads were all blocked by police. As a consequence, they had to store the tea in their home while they didn't have any specific facilities. And this is why you have the smoky taste, because in these villages they don't have wide access to power, which means they will most of the time have a fire lit in the living room. And anyway, the whole villages are kind of emboldened in smoke, especially in the evening, I think, when people try to put a fire to warm up a bit. And so to me, that's an example of what you could call terroir. The smokiness is not here voluntarily. It's not a conscious act of processing like you would have like for a smoke lapsang susong, like Zhengshan Xiaozhong in Fujian, where they would smoke the tea on purpose. And still, we know the explanation. We know why the tea is smoky. So to me, that's a big thing in the terroir. It's about some aspects of processing, storage, agricultural techniques, which are done culturally or out of necessity. And the question here is, should these processes be conscious or unconscious? So in this case, the smoky taste was not made on purpose, and still, so it's what defines a bit the character of this tea. Now, for example, if you went to the village, the processing would be a bit different. I think most of the villagers would give it much less shaching. Now, this tea was processed actually by the technician who does the training sessions for the farmers in the place we've worked. So he's had extensive training, and we've talked a lot with him about tea processing, and he's smart, so he processed the tea well. Now, if you went to the village, people out of habit would process the tea with not enough shaching. And one of the reasons they told us was that they lacked a bit of wood. It was hard to get a lot of firewood there, so they would try to save it, and that's why they wouldn't light a big fire like it's usually needed, and they wouldn't cook it for as long as needed. So could you say that this is part of the terroir? Because they're in a situation where they cannot get a lot of wood, they will tend to undercook the tea because they don't have easy access to electricity. Then they will light a fire, they will use fire for cooking, and then it will lead to a smoky tea. Is it part of terroir for you? Because I would say for me it is. And it's part, you could say it's the unconscious part of terroir. You go to an area and this is what you find for this and that reason. We could add the cultural reasons. Maybe at some points in the year they have festivals and it has an impact somehow on their agricultural practices. So for example, in Jingmai is populated by the Dai, and they have the Water Splash Festival, which is like the new year for them. And this festival occurs mid-April, And for them, it marks the beginning, well, the difference between the early spring season and the late spring season. Okay, so, and usually out of, you could say, a kind of coincidence, the rain usually comes around this time. But it's not precise, of course. The rain can come maybe 1 week after the Water Splash Festival is over. And yet, people usually will say that the tea that's made after the Water Splash Festival is a late spring tea, even though, according to more objective parameters, it would still taste and look like an early spring tea. So you see, these are cultural differences, and it means that in Jingmai, when you're closing into the Water Splash Festival, people are working very hard because they want to close their orders, they want to have enough tea to fulfill all their orders, and it means that the most expensive tea you can get is just the tea right before the Water Splash Festivals. Not because of it's of higher quality, but just because at that time of the year there's a big competition, there's a big demand for fresh leaves, because everybody wants to fulfill that order and get enough leaves to have a complete order. But this kind of problem would not happen, I guess, in a Hani community or in a Yao community, because they don't have the Water Splash Festival, and maybe for them they use a different indicator for making the difference between early and late spring. In the terroir, you could also think about the dynamics, the interactions between people. How is the tea sold? So in places, maybe you would have only a few people in the village who go out and sell the tea, which means that most of the tea producers would produce tea for people inside the village. And of course, in more famous mountains, most of the time, you would have more, you would have visitors who come to the mountain to buy the tea directly from the producers. And you can imagine that in this case, the producers will have to think more about branding and packaging, presentation of their tea. They will also have a more direct feedback on the quality of their tea. Maybe they will have to pay more attention to the hygiene, the cleanliness of their tea factory, because the final customer will be able to see it. Things like that. If I think about Yiwu, and it reminds me of the discussion I had with Philip from yiwumountaintea.com, who specializes in Yiwu tea, and he was telling me that in Yiwu a lot of the orders were already, like a lot of the tea was already booked before the season had even begun. And so, as far as I know, this is quite unique to Yiwu. Why? Because Yiwu is mostly populated by Han people who, for many reasons, were sent there while they had contacts in the big cities before, which means that the tea producers in Yiwu have privileged contacts. They have long-term contacts with tea buyers in the big cities. And that's how in Yiwu that system can work. If you go to Monghai area, I haven't heard of that kind of booking system, and I think that the relations tend to be a bit more short-term, or at least for obvious reasons there hasn't been that many long-term connections between the producers and the buyers, simply because the tea industry in that place is not that old. You could say that the longest relationship you can have is like 10 years old, while in Yiwu, as far as I understand, you can have business relations that have been going on for generations. And this is part of the terroir, I think, the social organization, both from the production to the distribution of tea. For example, what has changed a lot is that, I I made a mess here, huh? Iba is gonna be angry, I think, because this is the stuff she bought, you know, for taking the pictures, and I'm just putting tea all over. Well, we're not gonna tell her, and she'll be fine, you know, it's gonna dry. For example, something that has changed in the relations is that in the past, because tea was cheap, it would always be the tea gardens would only be cultivated by the local people, okay, mostly by the owners of the tea gardens. But nowadays, because there are more tea gardens and tea is more expensive, the tea producers most of the time will hire daily workers to do the basic jobs like picking tea, pruning, weeding, things like that. This probably led to a change in the practices themselves. Okay, this is something that I saw, I think, somewhere that said that in the past people would be more careful when picking because it was their own tea trees, while now the hired workers, what they think about is how much they will get at the end of the day, and this is only determined by how many kilos of teas they harvest. So they don't really need to care about the tea gardens because it's not theirs. So you could say that social connections such as these have an influence on the tea, and so therefore it's part of the terroir. Now we can talk about public policy too. Public policy has an influence, and I would say especially in China, the government has quite a lot of freedom in deciding on what a place will look like. For example, you could say that it's the government that really decided that Jingmai would be a touristy place, would be a fairly popular tea mountain to visit. Now, of course, I must say that Jingmai has probably among the most beautiful tea mountains that you have out there. But still, it's the government that allowed the construction, that pushed, for example, for the renovation of the houses to have them look a bit better than they look in random tea mountains. This is a whole issue actually in Jingmai. Maybe I will talk about it in another video. But the construction rules in Jingmai are very strict. You have to follow the design that's been imposed by the government, which is kind of a tradition, that's supposedly a traditional Dai design. Now and then they do a lot of advertising for they've built an airport mainly to provide easy access to Jingmai. They are rebuilding roads and stuff, and this is investments they do towards tourism that, for example, the government in Sichuan-Bana is much less inclined to doing, simply because maybe just because they don't need it actually. But it's true that you have more visitors in Jingmai than in any other mountains apart from Laobanzong maybe and Bingdao. But even then, in Laobanzong, people just go for the day, and they usually don't stay in Laobanzong in the evening because it's still close enough to Monghai. And of course, if you have a lot of tourists coming to your mountain, again, it's going to have an influence on your product. Maybe you're going to adapt your tea factory so that it looks good, so that it can attract tourists. Maybe again you're gonna need to clean it really every day because tourists are gonna see it. Maybe you're gonna sell more retail than wholesale, and it will influence on how you package your tea and how you produce your tea. Maybe, for example, if you have lots of tourists, then maybe hand processing will be privileged because it's more it's a better show, for example, than machine processing. But of course here it's very hypothetical, because I'm saying that Chiang Mai is a touristy tea mountain, but we haven't reached that level of tourism yet. Actually, yeah, you have lots of supposedly lots of tourists during the spring, but as tea producers, it hasn't influenced our life that much. Now you could also include the traditions in the terroir. There are different ethnicities, and they have a different relation to tea. For some, tea is just it's just a common goods, just like you would produce corn or rice, you produce tea. So what matters to them is simply the price they get, the efficiency of the system, things like that. But for other minorities, and I'm especially thinking about the Bulang, them they seem to have a very deep connection to tea, which goes beyond making money. You can see this because I think in all of the Bulang villages I've visited, there were tea trees. I've never seen a Bulang village without tea gardens. Even though it's only small tea gardens, they will always have them. And it seems that for them that the seeds are very important, so we can think also in terms of agricultural history that the seeds have traveled from place to place. And it's true that the places populated by the Bulang seem to have a taste in common. That could be due to the varietal they transported. They also might have some specific customs related to the tea that will influence their agricultural practices. For example, in the Bulang villages, I see very few machines being used. And I haven't pushed too much on the subject while interviewing the farmers, but it could be related to some cultural expectations of that tea has to be processed by hand. It could be. Oh, this tea is very good. It's not a shallow tea. It's not an easygoing tea, I would say. For example, it's not the tea that will really impress you at the first sip. But it has a really good mouthfeel and really a good vibe, I would say, over the brews. So I would say it's a kind of ambient tea, okay, to put you in a certain mood. It's not like you could say like a Naka or Jingmai that will be very straightforward and blow your mind at the first cup. I would say this is more, you need to have maybe at least 1 hour, of free time to enjoy this tea. Or it's also a good companion if you have work to do. This kind of tea also works well brewed in a mug. So yeah, you could say it's quite Guafongjai taste. The gardens are very remote. So you see, in that place, the problem is they don't have good roads. Well, is it? Yes, it's a problem for them. Now it's also part of the terroir. You see, that's what makes this area very distinct from most tea mountains in Yunnan. You cannot ride your motorbike to those tea gardens. You have to walk for maybe 1 or 2 hours before reaching them. So it takes some extra effort. It also means that in a day they cannot pick as much tea. Or if they do, sometimes they have to sleep in the tea garden, spend the night in the tea garden, and then come back to the village the next day, which means that maybe you will have too much withering for the leaves, or on the opposite, they won't have withered the leaves and they will be kind of reddened by staying in the bags for too long. I remember especially in Guafongjai area when I started in 2010, the processing was a total mess. Like yeah, I would say that the raw material was very good, but most people didn't like the way it was processed. And since 2010, there's been drastic improvements in most of the tea mountains. And these improvements have led to a homogenization of the taste of tea, I would say. Yes, for example, Boulang tea used to be very smoky, and now it's very rare. Or if the tea is smoky, it's not characteristic of Boulang tea anymore. I can't remember really what the typicity of Jingmai was, but I just feel overall the tea industry has been professionalized in Yunnan in the past 10 years, during the past 10 years. And so now you have it's much rarer to have real processing problems in Yunnan, but I would also say there tends to be less difference between each terroir. Now, improving the techniques was a conscious move. People wanted to make better tea, and while doing this, they influenced their terroir. Was it a good thing or not? I think it's a good thing because it was a conscious move, and if the producers want to change something, I think they shouldn't be held back by this idea of terroir. To me, the terroir is from the place of the viewer. Okay, so I think ideally, well, there are two ways to think about it. One way would be that the producer has no idea of what the terroir is. He's just doing his stuff, and people from outside observe him and see, you see, these people in this mountain act like this and that, and this is different from that other mountain, and that's why they are two different terroirs. But during this step, you don't talk at all with the producer, so as not to influence him, so that he keeps doing his traditional way. And with this approach, you could say you cannot really criticize what the producer is doing. You can't say whether it's good or bad for the tea, because there's a kind of sacred admiration for the tradition of a place. So it would be more like a work of archaeology, where you go to a place and you just observe and describe it and don't try to change it. So that would be the first way of seeing the terroir, a conception that is, you could say, that is the property of the consumer and of the culture outside the producer. And the second idea would be more of a deterministic approach, where the producer has thought about all the aspects of his tea production and decides what he does, and he does it also for the terroir. So he actively thinks about his area, and he decides. So he is the creator of the product, and all what he did was conscious. And I think as consumers, we always oscillate between those two ideas of terroir. In some ways, we like the first idea of we create actually the terroir as consumers, as buyers. We create that, and we like it because we create the meaning. So we're kind of proud because we found out actually what makes this terroir. We created the idea. So we can appropriate ourselves with these conceptions. But on the other hand, we also like the second idea of the producer, like the producer being proud of his way of life, of his traditions, of the being passionate. And somewhat advocating for a way of producing that is different from the one you'd get in another terroir. So you would meet different producers, all of them have strong opinions on how good tea should be, and that's why you like them. You like them because they have strong opinion, they are confident, even though the different people you'll meet will have different opinions. What matters is that their opinions are strong. Now the problem with this approach is that as a consumer, you're just being fed the information from the producer. And I would say this is what tends to happen in the more developed areas. I think that the terroir starts by an observation from the outside. And that should be the case, I think, for Pu-erh tea. I think most of the producers nowadays in Yunnan don't really have a mature idea of what their job consists in, what their terroir is. But it is being discovered. And as it is being discovered and shared among the farmers, then the farmers will take a more active role in building, in nurturing that idea of terroir. And yeah, I just said building, and I stopped saying that because I was thinking, is a terroir built, created, or is it simply revealed? And that refers back to those two differences. If you're an observer, a passive observer, then you will just reveal the terroir to the world. And if you're active in your role, then you can really build a terroir just like you build a brand. So this is an interesting question, and you can really think about how you see those tea mountains. But this question can arise in wine, olive oil, honey, all these products in which the terroir concept is quite relevant. You could also think like, why don't we create a terroir for every agricultural product? This would be possible in some ways. Yeah, if we decide not to create a terroir for corn, then maybe it's just society that decided that. Or well, if you dig in, really, you have this idea of terroir in many products. It's just it's not very popular. But developments now, and I think it's related to how we should want to sell agricultural products. So it would be more pushed by a marketing effort. These marketing developments push us to emphasize this terroir, and in that way, again, it can be first revealed. Like, let's say you want to sell potatoes and you want to sell expensive potatoes, then you're gonna roam the world and visit different potato producers, and then you will find some producers have different techniques, and you're just gonna put a spotlight on them and just describe their practices. So that will be the first method. You'll simply reveal the current terroir. And then maybe since their potatoes will sell better because they will have that first renown, maybe they will want to, well, first they will reveal, they will find out that their job has meaning, because some meaning will have been given by society, because they suddenly find out that they are in a famous potato terroir, and they will probably want to capitalize on this. So it could be increasing efficiency, producing more, rediscovering or creating traditions, actually, to celebrate these new things. And then you will be in that phase 2 of the terroir, where you really create and nurture the terroir. And saying this, it reminds me of my last interview with the Ai Xiangnan, the producer from Laomana, who said that they should venerate the tea because the tea allows them to live well nowadays. So which means that if I had visited him 20 years ago when they were very poor and the tea had no value, he wouldn't have said that. So I'm wondering what he would have said at this time about the importance of tea. Was it really important, or was it just there, and maybe they were just ignoring it? And I think in Yunnan there's been actually a revival of those tea traditions thanks to the increased price of tea. So and the problem is that people won't really tell you this because they don't notice it. Maybe because tea effectively gives them a good lifestyle. That's why they will worship tea. And then when you visit the village, yeah, you have lots of traditions around tea, but maybe these traditions are not very old. And this is something that I can remember from my conversation with my PhD friend, who told me that actually traditions don't have to be old. And this is something that's often overlooked. Traditions evolve a lot. Traditions are just customs, things that just a social standard that people do, and they can change very quickly. Yeah. Now the terroir is also influenced by the market, by the consumers. And for example, in the case of a new industry like the Pu-erh tea, you could think that the consumers are also learning about tea as fast, you could say, as at the same pace as the producers are learning about tea. So that's why you have that complex dynamic between a change in consumer tastes and a change in the producer's techniques and conception of what the good tea is. So I'm pretty sure that the taste of Pu-erh tea for the average consumer nowadays, the expectation is quite different from the expectation that he had 10 or 20 years ago. And so that's why it's going to be very dynamic, because these two parameters are always changing. Maybe you could say that as the producer is trying to adapt to the consumer's taste, by the time he has adapted, the consumer's taste has already changed. So there will be actually this. And why has the consumer taste changed? Because his perception of what the good terroir, of what producers should do, has changed, and this change was induced by the former change of the producer's techniques. So this interaction, I think, has an infinite number of turns. Now, if we think that a terroir is first revealed and then created, well, who should create the terroir really? In China, I think the government has a big impact. So when I was talking with my friend, he explained me that in France, the terroir ID, for example, in wine, is taken very seriously, and there are many discussions before doing any change to any naming system, any convention. There are extensive discussions with the farmers. And I think these discussions do not happen in China because we don't really care about the farmer's opinion. because it's an authoritarian regime. Whether that is good or not is another debate. But one of the thoughts I had was, is the development, can a terroir transcend itself in an authoritarian regime? Can the producers really be masters of their terroir, be the real ambassadors of their terroir, if they are not in charge? Actually, if they cannot really decide collectively on what should be done. Okay, so that's one thought. Now I think, for example, in Jingmai, so we've done research in Jingmai for quite some time, and I talked about the idea of terroir with many producers. Now I also find that there is a reluctance, for example, to rank different areas according to their taste. That reluctance comes from a need for social harmony. For example, when I said, yeah, the tea in Tappingjiang obviously tastes better than the tea that are down the slopes. So yes, there is a very tiny price difference in the leaves, but really not to the extent of the taste difference. And why is it so? I said maybe we should have a special label, for tea from Tappingjiang. But I was told that then the problem would be about inheritance and equality in the village, because some families don't have land on Tappingjiang. So you could say that a lot of the families, well, all the families in Jingmai have ancient tea gardens, but some of them don't have tea gardens in Tappingjiang. So if afterwards the tea leaves in Tappingjiang were way more expensive than the tea leaves down the slopes, that might create some social problems, some social inequalities. Now, of course, I think that's quite a short-term issue, because if you think along this logic, then you couldn't change anything really, because some families have more tea gardens anyway, and there are inequalities anyway. But it's an interesting reason, it's an interesting argument for not developing the idea of, for example, of having more precise plots that determine the price of tea. Now I would like to talk about terroir from the consumer's perspective. So I was thinking about what's terroir in my idea when I want to buy a bottle of wine. And I figure it's not so different from a brand, just a common brand, actually. My perception of terroir will be mostly influenced by advertisements, I would say. And maybe by the taste. And that's interesting, because so far I haven't talked at all about the taste of tea. But yeah, as a consumer, I would say my idea, when I buy wine, I try at least to associate some terroirs with a specific taste, and that's all what I'm interested in too. Because what about like the traditions, the public policies, the social interactions, I don't really have time, to research like what is the nature of social interactions among the wine producers of South Australia. I don't have time to do this kind of research if I'm not a hardcore wine enthusiast. So for most of the consumers, actually, the terroir will be related to a taste and maybe a packaging. For example, in France, the Bordeaux wine and the Burgundy wines, they are packaged in different bottles. And for example, when you see a Burgundy bottle, well, you're pretty sure it's Burgundy wine just by the shape of the bottle, even though I'm sure there are exceptions. And then the taste. So the problem is the taste. Then I would say with the taste we're not anymore in the definition of the geographer. That's where the difference would be, I think, between the terroir for geographers. So that would be all the factors that I've mentioned before, the factors that actually create the product. And then the consumer is not really interested in those factors. Or even if though he's interested, he doesn't really have time, he doesn't really have the means to understand them fully. But what he can taste is, he can just taste the taste, the fragrance, the profile, the mouthfeel. And I think for a tea drinker, a wine drinker, that's what the terroir would be. And then here it raises the question of forgery, because then I think that's the problem, for example, with champagne, where you can have things that really taste like champagne but do not come from that area, and the consumer wouldn't know if it wasn't for these official labeling systems. So in that case, wouldn't you say that the idea of terroir is a bit ridiculous? Because, at least for a consumer's perspective, because you would have the same taste, but you would have a huge price difference. From a geographer's point of view, it wouldn't be ridiculous, because the product would result from a different social organization, a different context, maybe different environment. But if I'm just a basic consumer and just taste the stuff, then what would push me to buy a real bottle of champagne that I will pay 5 times as much as a kind of other sparkling white wine that would be produced somewhere else and would taste the same? And then I would say that is prestige. It's for prestige that I would buy this expensive bottle of champagne. Wouldn't it be the same for tea, actually? If you want to buy a Laubanzang cake and that you are certified, you're sure that it's a Laubanzang cake, maybe you do it a little bit for prestige and not only for the taste. Now, Laubanzang is a bad example because I think it's very hard to imitate the taste of Laubanzang. But you could say that in this you have to approach. You could buy good price for value factory teas which have been blended, or not even branded teas. You could just buy the tea for the taste and just not care at all about the origin of the tea. Or you could say, I don't care about the taste, I want to have one tea from each famous mountain in Xishuangbanna. And then I will just explore the taste. Now, okay, in that case, maybe it wouldn't be just for prestige, it would also be for your personal research. And this personal research would allow you to actually create the meaning. It goes back to the two systems I mentioned earlier, like whether terroir is just a brand that is fed into the mouth of the consumer. So it's you want to buy a car, you have maybe 30 brands available. Well, you want to buy Pu-erh tea, it's the same. You have about like 30 different tea mountains available, and each of them has a personality that's been forged by the producers, by the government, and we give that personality, and then it's for the consumer to choose what he likes. Or you could say, here are the mountains, we don't know much about them, and it's up to the consumer to do the research, actually, and to create that idea of terroir. And why is Pu-erh tea currently in the West not extremely popular, but very much enjoyed by more hardcore tea drinkers? Maybe it's one of the reasons. It's because right now you're in a historical moment for Pu-erh tea. You're still at the moment, you're at the time when the terroir is being revealed. It's not fully revealed, and it's barely created at all. I would say most of the evolutions of Pu-erh tea have not been as well thought as in the wine industry, for example. So right now, when you buy your Pu-erh tea from Jingmai, from Bulangshan, from Yiwu, Mengku, Guangdong, Yongde, everywhere, you don't have that much information, that much marketing information about them. Sure, I can give you the altitude, I can talk about the traditions and stuff, but I think a lot of the meaning is still left up to the consumer. And yeah, maybe that's also why I like these products. It's really for me, it's really the way of tea. It's that finding the meaning, finding some meaning while tasting all these teas. So that's why I think in terms of terroir development, we are at a historical moment right now, and it's a great time if you're a geek to get into Pu-erh tea. Okay, I think that's it for today. I'm gonna keep drinking my tea. I'm already feeling the buzz now. I'm just gonna leave you with these thoughts on terroir. So see you later, and thank you for watching.